Now, in The Hobbit, the fantasy fiction book from which I took the alias Thorin, the character of Thorin, this dwarf heir to the throne of the dwarf kingdom, is someone who ends up afflicted by dragon sickness due to his overwhelming love of gold, and it nearly destroys him. But quite frankly, I don't even see what relevance that has to me in my career, because I mean, on a complete side note, I'm actually sponsored by esportspools, who's a fantasy esports and betting site. And you know what? Just sponsored by them because they made me a good offer. I checked it out. It's legit. They're above board. They're following all the rules you have to. It's a quality service. Lots of different options, lots of tournaments, lots of games. It's nothing to do with the massive amounts of money that they offered me as part of this sponsorship. The monetary rewards, the filthy Skrilla, my precious Skrilla. It's not because I'm dreaming of some hoard of gold, you know, of the magnitude that Smaug had in The Hobbit. You know, the iridescent glory of an Arkenstone to truly represent the jewel-like nature of my knowledge and analysis of the game and status as an heir to be the king of esports, the king of the historians. It's not in any way because I fantasize about and almost live in a deluded reality where I should be surrounded by opulence and gold and Skrill in a new El Dorado, a city of gold never to end for 1,000 years. No, it's just because Esports Pool sponsors me, actually. So Bjergsen, mid laner of TSM, Team Solo Mid, has been hailed as one of the best, if not the best Western player for the last 4 years. In fact, I think you could make a very good case that even without massive international success, which most of his rivals for the title of best Westerner ever had, he's already staking his claim for that, and in some people's minds might be the best Western player of all time in League of Legends. He's been domestically dominant. He's obviously been in every NALCS final. He's won a whole bunch of them. He's qualified for every World Championship and MSI beyond his first season when he was in NIP, you know, during the time he's been in TSM. He did win an international tournament when he won the IEM 10 World Championship. Let me think, what year was that? Would that have been? No, I think it was the IEM 9 World Championship, maybe, actually. The one that he won over World Elite in the final Team WE and beat Flash Wolves in the semi. And he's clearly got immense talent, a fantastically skilled player. He's got a work ethic that I think everyone now understands is impressive and admirable. Is one of the main reasons he's kept that level of consistency and continued to be relevant and considered a top foreigner and continued to build the expectations that, yes, he and his team have often failed to live up to at Worlds, but there is a reason why they build that up again and again. And even during the dark times of like Season 5 Worlds, where they never really had any chance to get out the groups, he was still a fantastic player. And in fact, that's when he hard carried the most for my money as an individual player, was that summer split where he did everything he could to get them to win an LCS, and they couldn't do it because the team was just run out of steam completely, and some of the players were a bit whack at that point in time, quite frankly. So beyond his talent, beyond his work ethic, beyond his accomplishments, lies what's really the driving factor towards such an excellent career. Because there's people who've been as talented as Bjergsen who haven't accomplished anywhere near as much. There's people who for a season have been as good or have shown flares and flashes of being amazing players, but they don't stay on top and they don't continue to adapt with the new era of the game, and they don't manage to find a way with new teammates to get the same success, and they don't always battle to improve and be very well rounded when they're very good at certain things. So the thing that drives him for me is his mentality, and I think his mentality is actually the most interesting aspect of Bjergsen. If you listen to interviews with him, if you see him on reality shows, and if, as I have had the good fortune to, occasionally you've been able to talk to him privately, because I actually think he does have, within a certain context and with caveats that I will go into, a top Korean's mentality. Basically, he has the mentality that I think does lead you, if you're a top Korean, to become a world champion, to become the best player in the world, to become potentially the best player of all time. Because generally, since Koreans are the best in League of Legends, that's really just code for he has a winner's mentality. Because winners think differently than other players. Like, think about it in terms of Bjergsen. He's already accomplished what is success or what is the goal for most other players. Like, Jensen is still tortured trying to win an NALCS. Bjergsen did that seasons ago. He's done that a whole bunch of times. In fact, that is the regular state of existence for Bjergsen, is to win the NALCS. Now, he's already got bigger fish to fry. He's doing that first, and then he's thinking, right, now let's get on to MSI, let's get on to Worlds, let's get some of that going. He's got a whole different level of success and context to his career than even the really good players of his era. Then you got to, so, I mean, he's a guy who has to look for his own satisfaction. He can't just look at like basic roadmarks of success and go, well, that's accomplishment to win LCS. He's done it so many times. For him, he knows that his career and his legacy is about doing something more than winning the LCS. So he's already separating himself from most of the Western players that ever existed. Then you've got to look at the fact that he's already been the best player. He's already been a fantastic player. He's already been a very well-rounded player at times. So he has to seek to find ways to improve himself and to be at his best for the next split. It doesn't matter that he was amazing 2 years ago. People want to see what he does this split or this next tournament or at the next international competition. So he's still looking at everything he's done, and I'm going to say, great, I've got to maintain that, I've got to adapt that, I've got to build on that, but I've got to look still for the little edges. It's like that old saying, okay, that the bigger you build the bonfire of knowledge, the greater the darkness of ignorance is displayed to be. That's what happens to someone like Bjergsen. To me or you, we see, look how fucking good he's gotten. You know, there must be, what, such a small edge, 5%, 1% between him and being the absolute best. But to him, the 5%, the 1% is another mountain to be climbed. And he's at the bottom of it each time. And he's having to try and scale his way up and find a way to get there. And there's no clear path along the way. There's no signposts. You can't just copy what a Korean did. And you've got no Westerners who've got kind of a path before them that you can follow the context of, because when they were beating Koreans, or they were doing very well internationally, it was a completely different world to the one you're in. You're having to adapt to a different world and meta each time. He's also someone where it's not even about individual excellence and mastery, because he's accomplished that and continues to accomplish that and is very far along on that quest. Now for him, because it's a team game and you cannot succeed at the ultimate level, especially the World Championship level, without your team as being very good and coordinated and working as a team, now he has to also, as well as working on his own individual game and keep himself motivated and keep himself adapting and improving, he has to also look to work better with his teammates, to improve others, to take on leadership components, shot calling, being a captain, giving confidence to others. I mean, I would actually use the analogy of something called the Kardashev Scale. And this was a scale that was about how you rate civilizations in terms of what capabilities they have. And so what he did was he ranked these 3 possible types of civilization. So a type 1 civilization was called a planetary civilization. And that's someone who can use and store all of the energy where it reaches its planet from a parent star. So in the case of, if we haven't even got to that stage, by the way, in terms of our Earth civilization, like we haven't managed to use and store all of the energy that comes from our sun. We've been unable to do that. Now, if we could go beyond that, and we could do that, a type 2 civilization, also called a stellar civilization, is one that can harness the total energy of its planet's parent star. So total energy, not just when it reaches Earth. Now, obviously, we're not even close to that. And then a type 3 civilization would be a galactic civilization, can control energy on the scale of its entire host galaxy. Now, in the context of a player, the reason I'm drawing this analogy is a type 1 player in this respect, type 1 great player, would be someone who's figured out how to use all of his own abilities as an individual player. Now, I would say then that a type 2 player, great player, is someone who's used all of his own individual abilities and has used most of the abilities of his team in general. So he's getting his teams around him to play his style and around him, and he's therefore elevating his own individual excellence because they become the platform which is elevated on which his greatness then shines further. But a type 3 great player is something that you maybe have had like a handful, maybe 5 or 6 ever in League of Legends. And this is Bjergsen's struggle and why his mentality is so key. Because for me, a type 3 player in this sense would be someone who, yes, has individually mastered the game in his own role. Yes, has gotten his team shaped around him, learned how to play with his teams in this context, but a type 3 one, and I've seen this in so many all-time great sports, it is the Kobe Bryants, the Peyton Mannings, the Tom Bradys, the Wayne Gretzkys, the Mario Lemieux. These are the guys, LeBron, these are the guys where they've done all those things, and then the last step is you have to figure out how to get the most out of all your teammates. You have to not just get your other star player to play well with you. You don't just have to just get the team on the same page playing around you or work with what your coach wants. You have to be able to get even the worst players on your team, the bench player or the player who's brand new or the player who's never had the big experience. You have to somehow transfer to him that DNA, that winner's mentality, to either help him identify what he needs to do to become very good individually or integrate him into what you are trying to do. Therefore, he becomes another tool, another vector through which your excellence can impact the game by how he thinks about the game on the similar page to you and is driven to be great, even though individually he will never be a Hall of Fame player, never be an all-time great player. And that's why you look at some of the players that those players played with, and when they were playing with them, they were good players. But aside from them, they're not going to go in Hall of Fames. But those guys managed to get the most out of them, and therefore they achieved the ultimate success in their fields. And for me, in the modern day, Bjergsen's the only person who's even battling for that among Westerners. I don't think anyone else has come close. Like, for example, High has had a lot of the other factors, Type 2 and Type 3, but he never got past Type 1. He never became individually excellent in the same way, obviously because he's been more limited. So I think that's an interesting way to think about these players, and I think that's also what thing that sets Bjergsen apart. And the reason I'm making that grand kind of analogy is because it makes Bjergsen very lonely in that sense. Like, he can't just talk to other great players who are Western players. He can't talk to even other Korean players because they live in such a different cultural infrastructure, I mean, competitive level of context that he's not in, so he can't apply the same things they did and follow their career path. He's having to go into uncharted territory himself, like the Knights and the Grail legends of Europe, where the whole thing is they go and they find the area of the forest that no one's been to, and they carve their own way through the trees to try and find the Grail, because that's the only way they'll be worthy of it. They'll be deserving of it if they indeed find it at that point in time. You look up, you got Joseph Campbell Grail legend stuff if you want to know more about that. So he's very lonely and isolated as a result in this context because no one can really understand him entirely. But what keeps him going is this curiosity. He's someone who he still knows he can improve. He still knows there's aspects and that the game's ever changing and the meta's ever changing. And so that spark of curiosity, that inspiration is still there. There's clearly a lot of passion in him as a player, and that's what keeps him going beyond. It's not just to get a placing on his Wikipedia, well, it's not really Wikipedia in League of Legends, Gamepedia or whatever, ranking of like, oh, I finished top 4 of the worlds or a final. It's not about that. It's about being the best, and then a byproduct of that is being able to do things no one else has done as a Westerner, perhaps do things no one else as a League of Legends player has done. That's what it's about. It's the quest for mastery of all respects, and in fact, the closer he gets in some of them, the more it makes him yearn for and long for and be curious as to how to improve in those other aspects, because that becomes the new game within a game once you've mastered the other elements that everyone else is still working on, sadly, and keeps getting reset and having to start again. And that's the thing about League of Legends that makes it so tough, is that you never do just get very, very high up and then you maintain and go on, because the game keeps changing, the way the compositions keep changing, the metagame of teams keeps changing, the patches come month to month, and as a result you have to keep getting knocked down and building back up and climbing back up the mountain. There's that Sisyphean component to it where you have to be able to take a pleasure in the toil, not just the success or the failure affecting you, but the toil and the daily struggle. And this is a guy where, in terms of the daily struggle, he's a fucking Iron Man. He's been coming to work with his hard hat and his pail, lunch pail, for day after day after day, putting in a full day's work, even when he was the best player, even when he was a champion. And in theory, you'd think it'd be his rivals who are practicing more than him. And generally, he's outworked these guys and had the curiosity to seek to find new ways to improve, where some of them have gotten very good and then gotten stuck in the mud. You look at each of his rivals each season, none of them are doing as well as him. None of them are as good individually as him overall, or have been able to put together the same kind of longevity. And there's a reason for that, and that is his mentality, and this is a component of it that's been so key. Within this context of the isolation of being this great player who's at a level others aren't and having to battle to find these edges, bizarrely comes a kind of assuredness, because even though he hasn't found the way, and so far no one actually can ever say if there is a way, no one knows if a Western team can ever actually win a Worlds. It doesn't seem that reasonable. Even if they did it, it'd probably be an upset. But yet he has an assuredness about him, I can tell you from talking to him, that's actually quite compelling, because he's a guy where, one thing I love about him as a player, and this is what I've always appreciated actually about players like Forgiven and Fallen, Forgiven and Froggen and Flame, etc., truly great players, and great players, Western and Korean, is that it seems like a weakness that they seem stubborn, right? But it's not, it's only a weakness when it does manifest as being stubborn. In the case of someone like Bjergsen, I'm sure at his worst it has manifested as being stubborn. You see when Lokodoko was his coach and when his team had really fallen off. Yes, at that point it probably did feel like him against the world, and he had to do a lot just in terms of his own shit and kind of get his, just to give his team a chance of winning. But actually, I would describe it more at its best as this curiosity combined with where he's gone that no one else has gone to and can really be able to relate to, and therefore communicate with him as an equal, as a peer. He has to be convinced of something before he will accept it as a fact. And that's a very good quality, because it means that he's going to pass information and his experiences by his own metrics. He's not going to let someone else tell him how to frame it and what the narrative was. And so, yes, you won't just be able to tell him, do this because that's what a top Korean team's doing, and he'll just do it and think that that's correct. No, he'll experiment, he'll try, but he has to prove out himself. And that's part of his success to this point, and how he got to this point and became a legend from just being a very talented rookie, and also why he's continued on at the top, whereas others have not. And so it's actually a positive in that sense. And in fact, if you ever talk to him, he's a guy who is very cerebral. who's very good at articulating. I mean, it's a shame he doesn't do more serious interviews. He's very good at articulating and outlining his thought process. Like, you might find a moment where it seems like he made a misplay or you wonder why he didn't do something. But when you listen to his description and his framework of how he saw the game and his perspective, you realize whether you agree with his decision in the end or not, he was thinking on a much, much higher level than the majority of players. And in fact, even analysts, etc., because they can't think just from that individual player's perspective. They're looking at a general idealized version of the game where they've modeled it typically based on Asian players and therefore a different mentality towards the game. This is one of those guys like Froggen, like Forgiven, where if you ask them to sit down and explain what they did in the game and why they did something, you can always see positives to it. You can always see aspects where they are right and where they've made really good points and where their experiences have led them to this point. And if you were in their shoes, maybe you would make that choice as well. Even if ultimately on an idealized scale, you maybe wouldn't say it was the best choice, or in the short term, they could have made a different choice to succeed. Now, part of this problem, part of this struggle, but part of what makes it compelling to see Bjergsen's story is that, yes, he's still searching for that next level, but only he can answer what that next level is. It's hard for him to even know, what do I subtract from my game to add something else? You can't just only add qualities. You can't just only emphasize all the best elements, because some of them are mutually exclusive. Some of them are decisions you have to make of what you will emphasize and what kind of player you will be. So he's in a very unique position there, because there's never been a player like him in the West. He's the first of his breed in that particular sense. And so you can't just say, do this like this other great player did. He's got a very unique problem that only he can answer. But one thing that's really positive, I have to say, is it doesn't matter how many times TSM's gotten wrecked at Worlds. And people, and for this one, obviously people blamed him and people have commented, haha, they're all shit, blah, blah, whatever. He actually never loses confidence. On some base level, he doesn't ever actually stop believing that it's possible, that he can keep improving, that he got a chance next year, that he can come back, that they can get a new team together, they can win LCS again, they can qualify these tournaments, and eventually it can happen. He doesn't know how it will happen or what he has to do necessarily, but he's trying to do what he can, and he knows that somehow it's possible at the end for that to be a byproduct of this individual mastery and then being able to work with teammates and empower them. So he doesn't have all the answers. Yeah, sure, he gets frustrated and gets disappointed at the results or a teammate and their lack of progression, but he still has that baseline of confidence that comes from this drive, or perhaps is something that informs this drive, or perhaps is a byproduct of the drive and knowing how much effort and dedication you've had to succeeding. Because yes, the clear knock on Bjergsen is his international issues. He's never typically been a massive carry internationally. He only really had that IEM that was truly spectacular. He had some good games otherwise, but often there wasn't that big a factor in them, like some of the Z games in Season 4 World Championship. So the problem here is it's a mystery. I mean, mental, psychological components are the hardest factor to A, predict, or B, overcome. I mean, if we're talking about trying to solve the riddles of someone's mind, people who are coaches aren't equipped for that. Other teammates aren't equipped for that. Other great players aren't equipped for that. Analysts aren't equipped for that. People on the outside, family members aren't equipped for that. You want this whole support system and you want people to give you tips and to give you feedback, but ultimately, you're the one who's going to have to crack the code. You're the one who's going to have to unify the disparate forces in your mind and the ones that battle you and become your enemy, your biggest enemy on those grand stages and in the big moments where you want to succeed the most. Because if you have not harnessed it, when it becomes isolated from you, that shadow, that subconscious can be truly your worst enemy, because it knows your darkest fears and it knows the moments in which you're the weakest, and it can exploit those and it can put the most pressure upon you. And that's why if you can overcome those aspects, it doesn't matter whether you win the title or not, that is the ultimate satisfaction. That is the ultimate euphoria. That is the peak experience, as Colin Wilson would say, of what you can have in life, pretty much. And why the great poets and writers and outsiders and dystopianists have these rare moments that are amazing in otherwise sometimes bleak lives. Now, one of the key aspects, because people might already be watching this going, okay, so you've talked up Bjergsen, you've said all these great things about him, but where are his results, right? He's got nowhere near the results of Faker and Mata and Wei Zhao and, you know, all these truly great Asian players, Uzi I, etc. He's never even made a Worlds final. He's never even made top 4 of the Worlds. He's never won a massive international competition, ignoring that IEM, which is a bit shaky. But here's the problem. Unlike those players, Bjergsen has not been shaped, especially the Koreans, by coaching, culture, and infrastructure in the same way as all of them have. So he isn't forced to improve and compete at a high level constantly by a coaching staff, because he has a coaching staff that can't communicate with him in that way, and itself doesn't have the credibility and legacy and tenure of some of the great Korean coaching staffs. He doesn't have teammates or positional threats, as in people who are in solo queue or super hyped players who, if he plays badly or underperforms in a split, they say, hey, we might bring this guy in for a few games and see how he does to put pressure on him. He doesn't have anyone like that. It wasn't until this season, actually, after Worlds, that people even started to conceive of a world in which maybe TSM should let Bjergsen go and pick someone else up for the franchising era. That was never even on the table before, because he was a straight MVP candidate every single fucking split since he got to NA. So he didn't have someone pushing him in the same way that actually even great Korean players do, where we see them get subbed out and you bring in the sub guy or the rookie guy, and therefore their position's at threat, actually. Then you've got to consider he doesn't have peers that push him in the same way. Whether that's on the ladder, he doesn't have as competitive an environment there. In scrims, are there people who can really dominate Bjergsen in scrims? Not really from what I've heard. And in terms of accomplishments, there's no one on this guy's level right now, in terms of the modern day, as in doing things after Season 3. Meanwhile, Koreans have, well, first of all, in Korea, you have no choice. To achieve domestic success is basically already to get to the level where you could win Worlds. So they have LCK, the hardest league to win in the world, the hardest league ever to win. Then they have World Championships, which you have to be very good in LCK already as a filter to get through to the World Championships. You probably already are in position to potentially win a World Championship if you can get there. Not the same for Bjergsen and LCS. Then you've got the godlike players and first ballot Hall of Famers that are still playing in Korea. Like, you've got Faker, and you've got Smeb, and you've got Prey, and you've got Gorilla, whatever position you play at, got Score. These guys are there, and if you're one of their peers, they're going to push you daily, because otherwise you're not even going to be better than them. Never mind be the best player in your country, or the best in the world, or the best of all time. And then, as I said, they've got the coaches. They've got the demand for success today. They're not exaggerating in those interviews where Faker will say some comment like that, you know, if he fails to win Worlds or LCK, that it's failure. Now, he's already had the ultimate goal on the domestic and international level multiple times. But he knows that if he doesn't win this one, it's a failure and it means something for his legacy. It's not about doing it once. It's about doing as many times as you can. So as you show, as I again said before, the success doesn't say that you did it right, but it's a byproduct of the ultimate level of mastery individually and in a team context. Then you've got to consider, look at the other great foreigners. All of them had flaws that actually were worse than Bjergsen's in many ways, despite the fact some of them had more success thanks to their primes coming earlier on when Koreans weren't as good and there wasn't as much infrastructure in Korea, and generally the game and the meta were more limited and could be more individually played. So, okay, Froggen in terms of longevity absolutely is up there with Bjergsen. I think you could still make a case he's the strongest foreigner of all time, but a lot of his accomplishments are going to rest on the early days, aren't they? You look in the modern day, he's still a very good mid laner and certainly underrated if people think he's not good just because he's on a bad team in Echo Fox. But he certainly has been too stubborn at sometimes. He's taken that aspect of, you've got to prove it to him. And I think he's gone to the too stubborn side because, one, he's never had teammates as good as him. He's never had the really good teams around him generally. And secondly, he has, if anything, actively avoided having like coaches who can dictate what he does and really try and break him out of his shell. And so in many senses, he's been the shot caller and the coach of many of his teams, at least for him as an individual player. So he's been limited by where he as a person can get to, and he hasn't had the influence of a Koma or any of these guys you think of from the Korean and the Asian scene who are legendary and who've had a big impact. Then you've got to look at Alex Ich. So Alex Ich was amazing for the first few years, has been completely irrelevant since. He's not even relevant to this discussion now. Jensen, yes, right now he's amazing. Right now, individually, he's competing with Bjergsen. First of all, he's had a massive teammate turnover, so he's never had the proper core to work with in that team for my money. Secondly, for me, he's still stuck at the Type 2 part. For me, yes, Type 1, he's mastered how to be an individual player. He's incredible already. But his problem is he's still trying to work out how to make some of his teammates work well with him. His jungler work well with him. His top laner work well with him. He hasn't got past that. Never mind get to Type 3 where Bjergsen is, where you've already done that, and now you're trying to get everything out of everyone on your team and use them all as a vector for potential success for you individually and the team. And then finally, you got to throw Doublelift in there because he's been so good for so long. His problem is he's one of the biggest messes mentally, because even when he's confident, there's like always a little shard within their weakness that can suddenly break out. And because his whole mindset's about how confident he is and how cocky he is and how he knows he's going to win, that's what destroys him and makes him, like, if you notice, Doublelift's way of tilting now is very different from before. Before, he would try to make too many hero plays and fuck it up. In the last couple of years, he's been too hesitant. He's been not wanting to pull the trigger and trying to figure out what the ideal situation is. And, you know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, as it goes. And that's been his problem at times. And so also, he's been a real mess in terms of the Type 2 and the Type 3 thing of using his teammates properly. I think he at times gotten to Type 2. He's never been close to Type 3. So the problem for Bjergsen is he is alone. He's the only one on this path. He's the only one as far along as he is. And obviously, it's his own path he's gone down. So he has to figure it out on his own. But for my money, he has a winner's mentality.
Hey, this is Cap, and you're watching Thorin, the only man besides Richard Lewis who somehow found a way to get both League of Legends and Dota Redditors to hate him.